Preserved in Italy's Turin Cathedral is one of Christianity's most famous holy relics, the Turin Shroud. It's said to be the burial cloth in which Jesus was wrapped after his crucifixion over 2,000 years ago.
The shroud completely inspires those who believe in it because we have to remember, Jesus left no physical trace of himself on earth. He wrote nothing. There's no archaeological evidence, actually, that he existed. But if the shroud is real, then this is tangible proof that he did.
The Turin Shroud might be the silver bullet that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt the existence of Jesus Christ.
Incredibly, it seems Jesus' image was somehow imprinted on the Turin Shroud when he was buried. Although the image is very faint, a negative is much clearer. Could this really be the face of Jesus after his death, crowned with thorns? Millions of Christians faithfully believe so, as do some scientists.
I think we can be certain that this is the burial wrapping of Jesus.
Skeptics disagree.
Unfortunately, it's a pretty obvious fake from the Middle Ages.
What is the truth? Is the Turin Shroud genuine? Or can other amazing explanations solve the puzzle of its mysterious properties?
It's not the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It's the world's first photograph, created by the world's greatest genius, Leonardo da Vinci.
Turin Cathedral is home to one of the most famous Christian relics on the planet, the Turin Shroud.
The Turin Shroud is so iconic because it represents what might be the only physical, tangible proof of Jesus Christ.
The shroud gives a face to a man whose legacy has dominated so much of human history. His physical anatomy is visible on this shroud, and that's incredibly powerful for many people.
But is the Turin Shroud really the genuine burial cloth of Jesus? Today, the Turin Shroud is displayed to the public only on rare occasions. But a modern copy is on permanent display in the Church of the Holy Shroud near Turin Cathedral. Bruno Barberis is the scientific coordinator of Turin's International Centre for the Study of the Shroud.
We can see the most important thing, the double human image. Here we can see the face, the chest, the hands, and the legs. The blood image are clearly distinguishable due to the fact that they are more red. In my opinion, the probability that is not a fake, but is really the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth is very, very high.
Skeptics, however, are convinced that the Turin Shroud is not Jesus' genuine burial cloth. Partly because the first solid historical evidence of the shroud's existence isn't until it appeared in France in the 1350s, nearly 1,400 years after Jesus' death.
The shroud shows up under very suspicious circumstances in the hands of a soldier of fortune named Geoffroy de Charnay. And he never was able to say quite precisely how he, a man of modest means, had acquired the most holy relic in Christianity.
Adding to doubts about the shroud's authenticity, a French cleric of the time denounced it as a forgery.
When the shroud was first exhibited in the 1350s, the local bishop complained and said that this was a bad thing, this was misleading people, and he said he even met the painter who'd painted it.
Despite this, the legend of the shroud as the true burial cloth of Jesus continued to grow over the centuries. A fire damaged it in 1532, causing burn marks and water stains. But the nuns quickly patched it up. And in 1578, it was moved from France to Turin, where it's been treasured ever since. Yet given the shroud's cryptic origins, today the Vatican is officially cautious about whether the shroud is genuine or not.
The Church, or the Catholic Church's position with the Turin shroud, is actually very ambiguous. They don't say it's a forgery or a fake or a painting, and neither do they say, it's the real thing. They have some ambiguous statement that's very carefully crafted to say that people must believe what they must believe. And that's, a really kind of cheeky, in my opinion, way of giving their room for doubt for those people, who are religious and do choose to believe it, and they can take from that statement from the Vatican that, in fact, well, they're not saying it's not true.
The Church doesn't actually say itself that this is a literal image of Christ. They refer to it not as a relic, but as an icon, that it's a representation of Jesus. So if you want, the Church itself seems to be keeping its options open.
True believers and skeptics alike want to resolve the debate about the shroud once and for all. For over 40 years, both sides have turned to science to provide the definitive answer. The first large-scale scientific investigation of the shroud was carried out in the late 1970s by the Shroud of Turin research project. Barry Schwartz was a photographic expert on the primarily American team.
We did a myriad of different types of photography, but we also did spectral analyses, X-ray and X-ray fluorescence, and reflectance analysis. So we had all of these different pieces of equipment at that moment in time that were state-of-the-art, and ironically, the single question we went to answer, how is the image formed, we were unable to answer. We knew of no mechanism that could make an image with the chemistry and physics that we found on the shroud. And because of that, I came to accept that this was most likely the burial shroud of the historic Jesus.
Barry Schwartz was involved in a scientific analysis of the Turin shroud in 1978. He conducted an optical analysis of the shroud, and he and the project, which became known as STURP, Shroud of Turin Research Project, were resolute defenders, I think it's fair to say, of the shroud, of its veracity. And ever since 1978, Barry has been really an advocate for the truthfulness of that icon.
Since Schwartz's team examined the Turin shroud in the late 1970s, many others have done scientific studies of their own. Some have agreed that it's likely to be authentic, but many others have declared the shroud to be a medieval fake.
So now we have all these scientific proofs that the shroud is real, along with the scientific proofs that it isn't. The debate rages, but this is one of the most central artifacts in Christianity, if it's real.
One of the most recent scientific studies, published in 2018 by forensic anthropologist Dr. Matteo Barini, employed bloodstain pattern analysis, a technique often used in criminal investigations.
Morning, people. So ready to start with the experiment? Yeah, very good.
In the first part of his recreated experiment, Dr. Barini is comparing the blood pattern on the Turin shroud to how Jesus would have bled if he was crucified on a traditionally shaped cross.
So now your arm is extended like the classical crucifixion position, so with the arm completely horizontal. So now, exactly, we see here the bleeding with the arm completely extended. So what we see is that there is just a bleeding that is going down, following the law of gravity, going down 90 degrees. However, what we see in the Turin shroud is not this.
Instead, the blood from Jesus' wrists, as seen on the Turin shroud, didn't drip at a 90-degree angle to his arms, but dripped along the length of his arms. But this doesn't necessarily mean the Turin shroud is a fake.
We have a very particular image of Christ on the cross, and that's because of centuries of medieval and Renaissance art that have fixed this vision in our mind. But actually, Roman crucifixions equally took place on X-shaped crosses T-shaped crosses, or simply even nailing the victim to a tree that was still living. So Christ's crucifixion actually could have taken any one of these forms.
As a result of this, Dr. Barini repeats the experiment as if Jesus was crucified with his hands nailed high above his head.
Yes. Here you see, I will hold your arm so you will not feel the pain of a proper crucified person. As you can see here, the blood is coming down quite vertically. Now, this is the direction that we have in the Turin Shroud.
Scientific testing could support the authenticity of the Turin Shroud if Jesus' hands were nailed high above his head. But what about the evidence suggesting the shroud is a medieval forgery? And if it is a fake, who would have had the motive and skill to create something so convincing that it's fooled millions of people for centuries? There is another test that the shroud must pass in order for it to be considered real. And so, for over 40 years, scientists have sought to identify the date in which the shroud was created, in the hope of revealing whether it really dates back to the time of Jesus' crucifixion, or if it is a later forgery that has continued to fool people for centuries.
The single best scientific data point we have on the shroud is carbon dating that was done in 1988. It was done immensely scientifically and independently and overseen by the British Museum. Strips of the cloth were sent to Oxford, to Arizona, and to Zurich, and they all tested independently of each other. And the results that came back with a 95% certainty were that the linen dated from between 1260 and 1390.
So if the carbon dating was accurate, the Turin Shroud is a medieval fake, dating to the 13th or 14th centuries. But if this is true, who could have created it? And what were their motives? Again, there are many theories.
Most medieval people were illiterate. The way they got their knowledge about Christianity and the saints was through images. These were paintings in churches, these were flags, these were stained glass windows. The Turin Shroud falls into this category. This is a pictorial demonstration of a key moment of Christ's life, and it's educational and instructional.
I think you simply have to look at the Turin Shroud as a work of art. You know, it's clearly going to have been painted in some way, using some sort of pigment or ochre, and it was clearly there as a kind of relic for the credulous and the gullible and people you're trying to make believe.
But if it is a fake, it is clearly a very convincing one. And one shroud researcher in particular, Lynn Picknett, claims to have identified the person who faked it so convincingly. Very few people would have had the motive and talent, besides one of the greatest artists, scientists, and inventors of all time, Leonardo da Vinci.
We can't be certain who commissioned Leonardo to fake the shroud, but almost certainly it was someone in the Vatican, perhaps even the Pope, because in those days they were very corrupt. And basically they wanted the ultimate Christian relic that would pull in the punters and line their pockets.
From the late medieval ages, there was a significant commercial value in having holy relics because you would draw pilgrims not only to your church, but to your city, and that was a significant source of income.
We know Leonardo was given a room in the Vatican, a secret room. We don't know much about what happened in there, but whatever it was, it involved a machine made of mirrors, and it is said that whatever went on in that room, the German mirror makers that were employed ran out screaming that it was sorcery, and it seemed to involve huge flashes of light.
Lynn believes that Leonardo da Vinci had the equipment and skills even in the 15th century to experiment with photography. She claims the Turin Shroud is actually the world's first photograph.
I personally have no doubt that Leonardo had the technological know-how and means to fake the Turin Shroud. Leonardo invented so many innovative things that have only come to mass production. Helicopters, flying machines, all sorts of technological devices that were hundreds of years ahead of their time. And he was working with camera technology.
He built a camera obscura, which he called artificial eye, with a little hole in one wall, and you projected images through it onto the inner wall. What you had to do is you put a cloth in the camera obscura coated with light-sensitive chemicals. Chemicals that were readily available in Leonardo's day, for example, egg white and urine, and basically the light hits it and the image forms.
But developing a photograph using a camera obscura can take several days. So it's very unlikely Leonardo da Vinci got someone to stand still for so long in front of the pinhole. Instead, Lynn believes that Leonardo used the body of a corpse and the cast of a Jesus-like face to create his photographic image of Jesus on the shroud.
The idea that Leonardo da Vinci could have effectively created a Renaissance-era photograph of Jesus isn't quite as outlandish as it may seem, because for one thing, the idea of the camera obscura was known 500 years before Leonardo, and we know from his drawing of the Vitruvian Man that he was fascinated by the way that human bodies move and so on. So it might have been that the Turin shroud was one of Leonardo's more bizarre experiments.
Leonardo had no compunction about doing terrible things to corpses in his anatomical researches. He would have experimented until he got it right. He would have crucified the corpse.
Then Lynn believes Leonardo da Vinci illuminated his cast of a Jesus-like face and the crucified corpse, projecting their images through a crystal lens onto the light-sensitive cloth in the camera obscura.
After a couple of days, you take the cloth out and you wash it in cold water. And you're left with the light bits. The dark bits just wash away. So you've got a negative image, essentially. And there you have it, the Shroud of Jesus. And then you paint blood on. And you've got it. And the pilgrims come in and they go, wow.
It's an extraordinary idea. Can it really be substantiated that Leonardo da Vinci crucified a corpse in order to create Christianity's best-known holy relic? Lynn Picknett is committed to trying to prove this theory beyond doubt. Yet there is still the possibility that the Turin shroud is genuine, and to this day, scientists continue carrying out experiments to try to verify its authenticity. Although the radiocarbon tests carried out on the shroud in the 1980s dated the shroud to be the 13th or 14th centuries, some refuse to accept their conclusion that the shroud is therefore some kind of later medieval forgery. Many have identified what they believe to be inaccuracies in the scientific process used, coming up with a myriad of explanations for why the tests could have come back with dates that do not fit with the crucifixion of Christ.
So one prominent line of argument is that soot from the fire that the shroud suffered impregnated the fibers, and that has thrown off the carbon dating. Well, it's a theory that you can put forward, but the scientists who conducted the carbon dating have addressed these issues and say absolutely not. Their tests take account of these factors.
So even though carbon dating has put the shroud firmly in the late 13th century, 14th century, those who believe that it's genuine have hit back by saying that the shroud has been in 2 or 3 fires, I mean one in the medieval era, and that it may have become contaminated by soot, by other debris, and that's what accounts for the carbon dating.
I have friends that are pro-shroud. I felt when the carbon dating was done, I felt genuinely sorry for them because I knew they were briefly, only briefly, they were devastated. And then they came up with several hopeful theories and they were back off and running again.
One long-standing Turin shroud researcher who doubts the reliability of the carbon dating results is Stephen Mattingly, recently retired after more than 30 years of working as a professor of microbiology at the University of Texas.
When the radiocarbon date came out, that kind of convinced me at the time that it was medieval and it was some kind of fake. But since I've thought about it and got involved in the research and thought about it scientifically, I realize now that it is the actual Shroud of Jesus.
According to Mattingly, the shroud was dated inaccurately to medieval times, and not only due to fire. He believes the shroud could have also become contaminated by bacteria.
The radiocarbon labs didn't take into account the microbial and the fungal contamination because of the fact that the components of bacteria and fungi and cellulose are identical. We really cannot use that as an indication of, you know, the date of the shroud.
He believes that one source of this bacteria could have been the air around the shroud.
Common contaminants, Bacillus subtilis, are in the air everywhere. Each day they're adding new carbon, radioactive carbon. So the contamination issue is something we can't deal with as far as the Shroud of Turin is concerned.
Most significantly, Mattingly believes that not only did airborne bacteria affect the carbon dating of the shroud, skin bacteria also created the mysterious image of Jesus. Mattingly says that to create a really strong image on cloth, you need huge numbers of bacteria. And he says that's exactly what happened as a result of Jesus' crucifixion. His bloody death provided the perfect conditions for bacteria to multiply on the skin.
We know that they added a crown of thorns early on, and anybody that's ever had a wound in the head knows that it bleeds forever. There are reports of over 100 scourge marks on the body, front and back, that would also bleed. So we have an individual that essentially is bleeding continuously. And there are consequences to that. Most importantly, the fact that Jesus' own skin bacteria began to grow. They had all the nutrients they needed, and they would double every 30 minutes. So when the shroud was removed, it left the excess bacteria from his skin on the shroud. And that's what created this wonderful image.
To demonstrate scientifically that Jesus' skin bacteria could have created the image on the Turin shroud, Mattingly is going to coat his hand with some skin bacteria grown in his home laboratory and then imprint his hand on some cloth.
And I begin coating my fingers. This is Staphylococcus epidermidis, which I obtained from my own hand and brew it up. And we just keep repeating this.
But skeptics find it difficult to believe bacteria on Jesus' body could have created the image on the Turin shroud. And they point to the Bible for supporting evidence.
The synoptic Gospels, those that see things the same way, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they do speak about Jesus' body being wrapped in a shroud. But John, which many think is the most accurate Gospel, actually doesn't. It talks about linen strips and even a separate headpiece. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Gospels is what they don't say. If there had been an image on the shroud, you would expect them to have recorded that.
According to Mattingly, however, Jesus' image on the shroud may have simply needed time to develop after the shroud was removed from his body. As his experiment shows, an image created by bacteria does take a long time to develop.
You really can't see much right now. This will continue to develop over time.
The hoped-for image on the cloth is just barely visible for now. But the experiment was brief, and Mattingly says that Jesus' body was covered with billions more bacteria than his own hand. and Jesus' image also had much longer to form on his burial shroud. To demonstrate the principle, Mattingly shows an image of his hand on his computer that he created with bacteria years ago.
This was done about 20 years ago, and the color has developed over time. This is the negative, and it shows even more detail.
Although his theory is very controversial, as a result of his experiments, Mattingly is convinced that the image on the Turin shroud was created by bacteria multiplying on Jesus' skin during his bloody death. As a Christian, he finds Jesus' image on the shroud reassuring.
I have no trouble being a Christian and a scientist, but the truth has to be through science. I think we can be certain that this is the burial wrapping of Jesus. We talk about wanting to see his face in our prayers, and here it is. Here is his face. What does Jesus look like? We know what he looks like. We know how tall he was. We know many things about him because of the shroud.
Could Stephen Mattingly's remarkable theory be true? Did bacteria from Jesus' body really create the image on the Turin shroud? Some skeptics believe Jesus' physical representation on the shroud isn't realistic, suggesting that the shroud may be a medieval fake. To help solve the mystery, some look for clues in the history of Roman crucifixions. It can sometimes be overlooked that crucifixion was a punishment the Romans meted out to vast numbers of people. But the way in which Jesus' body was taken down from the cross and given a proper burial would seem unusual.
People who were crucified were normally crucified as seditionaries. They'd committed treason against the Roman state. And so normally they were left to just hang there, being pecked at by the birds and eaten by animals, and their body would have rotted on the cross. So the idea of somebody being taken down from the cross and being given a lovely burial with a shroud, highly unlikely.
Scientific evidence also provides important clues about whether the Turin shroud is genuine. Blood-stained pattern analysis has shown Jesus' wrist wounds are realistic if he was crucified with his hands high above his head. But what about other bloodstains on the shroud? In particular, the Bible mentions a wound caused by a Roman soldier who stabbed Jesus in the chest. Believers in the authenticity of the Turin shroud say the chest wound left this bloodstain. And also on the back of Jesus' body, this wide belt of blood. Is this realistic? To replicate the spear wound, forensic anthropologist Dr. Matteo Barini uses a simple method, a sponge on the end of a spatula.
This is the most to reality reproduction of what could happen. And here you see the direction of the blood following the gravity. But we have a problem. Here the blood is going down and is not going in any way behind.
Then how could the belt of blood on the back of Jesus' body on the Turin shroud have been caused by the spear wound? It's been said by some that the belt of blood could have been created if Jesus continued to bleed after he was taken down dead from the cross and was lying flat in his tomb. But is this possible?
I want to try to replicate this second bleeding. So this, for us, is representing the shroud, and this is the individual bleeding through the wound on the chest. It is expanding. And now we move the body, if you can, Alfie. Very good, great. Now, look at this. There is a big pool of blood here on the funerary cloth. And this is what we do not see in the Shroud of Turin. And this is absolutely non-realistic.
Overall, blood pattern analysis cannot recreate the wide belt of blood on the back of the Turin shroud, supposedly caused by the spear wound to the front of Jesus' body.
I think it's fair to say that Professor Barini's test pretty much proves that the shroud is a fake, at least on the criteria that he used, mainly because the front and the back simply don't match in terms of the wounds and the direction of blood.
In my personal opinion, I think that the Shroud of Turin was made in the medieval time where the majority of people were illiterated, so were not able to read the Bible and the Gospels, so was like a painting to educate people.
If the Turin Shroud was created as a painting to enlighten medieval Christians, this could explain another surprising feature of the shroud. While the average height of a man in Palestine 2,000 years ago was about 1.65 meters, Jesus, as he appears on the shroud, is much taller, closer to 1.85 meters.
When you look at the shroud image, immediately you're struck by this very long, thin figure that's very unnatural in its elongation. And having studied Christian iconography, I recognized that this was just French Gothic art. It was the most obvious explanation, and that fit, you see, with its origin in France in the Gothic period.
There is no evidence that this is the actual burial shroud of Christ. In fact, it happens that most of the evidence points towards it being a medieval creation.
The Turin Shroud is not genuine. It is a very impressive, highly accomplished, rather wonderful piece of medieval art.
It's conceivable that Jesus' elongated body on the Turin Shroud just indicates he was unusually tall. But the suggestion that the shroud is a Gothic medieval painting designed to educate the faithful is a strong possibility. If the Turin Shroud is actually a painting, in theory it should be possible to replicate it, recreating on cloth a very similar image of Jesus. But can a convincing, full-scale replica of the Turin Shroud be created today? Luigi Gala-Skelly, former professor of organic chemistry at the University of Pavia in Italy, has tried to do this. But before attempting to create a realistic replica of the shroud, Gala-Skelly first ruled out how it wasn't made.
If we think that it was a medieval artist to make the shroud, probably the first attempt he did was to see what the print of a real body leaves on a linen cloth. So we tried actually this. We covered a volunteer with a red paint, and we put a sheet flat on him. And this is the result. As you see, it looks very bad. It's distorted. Look at the face, completely awful. So this is not how the shroud was made. It's not the contact print of a real body.
Instead, Gala-Skelly tried to recreate the shroud using a technique known as bas-relief, rubbing the outside of a sheet to reveal the contours of the body wrapped within.
We have a volunteer under the sheet, and we have rubbed with a dry pigment the cloth. So we have followed the shape of the body. As you can see, it's not distorted. This is more shroud-like.
Unlike the rest of the body, a real face still appears distorted using the bas-relief technique. So the face of Jesus in this image was created using a contoured, flat plaster mold.
So this is a very simple technique available in the Middle Age. This is the only way you can have a face undistorted.
Gala-Skelly is using blue pigment to highlight the fact that the color doesn't matter. He says the faint image of Jesus on the shroud is a kind of ghost image of reddish acidic impurities left behind by the original colored pigment that has completely faded away over the centuries.
Now we will have to artificially age this image because the shroud had centuries to do so, but we want to do that in an hour, so we will put it into an oven at 160 degrees Celsius to simulate the aging.
After an hour in the oven, the image is washed to remove the pigment. Only the pigment's acidic impurities now remain on the cloth, which is then ironed dry.
Now the pigment is gone, and this is the image on the surface of the linen, nothing behind. And the final test would be to take the negative of this image and see if it looks like that of the shroud. So just a quick test with a cell phone, and yeah, this is the negative. It looks like the Shroud of Turin.
After adding his homemade facial replica to a similarly aged bas-relief of the volunteer's body, Garlaskelli then painted on bloodstains in order to create a full-scale duplicate of the Turin Shroud.
Personally, I find Professor Garlaskelli's bas-relief analysis extremely convincing. The image that resulted from this technique is one that closely resembles what we see on the shroud. So really a remarkable job.
Others aren't convinced by Garlaskelli's recreation and say that it doesn't prove the Turin Shroud was painted. In particular, Shroud researcher Lynn Picknick remains convinced that the Turin Shroud is the world's first photograph created by Leonardo da Vinci, and she claims to have found further evidence to prove it.
The shroud has often been said to behave like a photograph. When seen in photographic negative, it almost leaps into life, into focus. It's quite astonishing.
Lynn's theory that the Turin Shroud is the world's first photograph is very contentious, but she has carried out experiments that indicate it is possible. By projecting an illuminated cast of a girl's head onto a cloth in a camera obscura, just like the one she believes was used by Leonardo da Vinci, she was able to create a recognizably shroud-like image of the girl's face. As for the face that Leonardo used when he created the Turin Shroud, Lynn believes, very controversially, that Leonardo used his own face to represent Jesus.
Leonardo would have thought, yeah, well, you're not going to get Jesus. Obviously, you're going to get my face. Leonardo was a heretic. He had very passionate beliefs, and they weren't Christian. In fact, there's every reason to believe that he hated Christianity, and therefore, faking the Turin Shroud was an act of rebellion. It just would have appealed to him.
Lynn's entire theory about Leonardo da Vinci, however, is considered very far-fetched by most observers.
The claim that Leonardo da Vinci made the Shroud of Turin, it's just not credible.
I love this theory that Leonardo da Vinci somehow created the Turin Shroud. He was an amazing visionary man, but even he couldn't have created something before he was born.
The problem is that Leonardo wasn't born until 1452, whereas the first generally accepted historical account of the shroud places it in France 100 years earlier. However, Lynn claims that the Turin Shroud isn't the same shroud as the one displayed in the 1350s. She says it's significant that this earlier shroud was soon denounced by the local bishop as an artistic forgery.
Unfortunately, it was a blatant painting. So clearly what happened was the church liked the idea of having the shroud, the ultimate Christian relic, Jesus' own image and blood. But they didn't want that one.
According to Lynn, the original unconvincing shroud was secretly switched by the Catholic Church in the late 15th century, when it was taken from France to Italy. Leonardo's new, much more realistic shroud was then displayed in its place in order to attract as many pilgrims as possible. Despite critics who say that this is a fanciful and highly unlikely story, Lynn claims to have found further evidence that Leonardo really did create the Turin Shroud. She's found clues in the Salvator Mundi, the famous picture of Jesus said to have been painted by Leonardo.
If you split the Salvator Mundi down the middle, and you have that on one side, and on the other side, you have a picture of the Shroud of Turin, what you get is astonishing. Every single tiny feature lines up exactly. The Salvator Mundi, strange though it may seem, is actually also Leonardo. But there's more. Salvator Mundi is holding a globe, a crystal globe. And people have said, well, of course, the name means Saviour of the world, so that's it. He's got the world in his hand. But it's actually a crystal. And what did Leonardo use to create the image of the shroud? A camera obscura in which he put a lens made of crystal. This is his nearest thing to a confession he created the Turin Shroud.
Whatever the truth is about this amazing theory, the debate about the Turin Shroud will surely continue for years. Is it the world's first photograph? Is it a medieval painting? Or is it the genuine burial cloth of Jesus, imprinted perhaps by bacteria, with an image of his crucified body? Although carbon dating has provided compelling scientific evidence suggesting that the Turin Shroud is not genuine, believers continue to dispute the study's accuracy.
I just think this tells us that believers will always find fault with any amount of evidence that they're presented with.
I think that for some people, the idea that the shroud is the real thing that wrapped Jesus Christ's body is too beautiful to be impossible.
You could say that the Turin Shroud shows that we're a world divided between believers and non-believers, between those who want proof, scientific, rational proof if you want, and those who believe that faith is important. For them, believing that it is the image of Jesus is enough. That sense of wonder is enough for them.
In a way, the shroud brings out wonderfully that conflict that we all have between the rational and the romantic. It's wonderful to believe that the shroud might be real. It's a little tedious to have science tell one it isn't. But we all have within us that need for both. That spark of the imagination is always there. And for so long as humans have that, the shroud will have its supporters.
And so, regardless of the scientific evidence indicating whether it is or isn't the genuine burial cloth of Jesus, for millions of people, the Turin Shroud will undoubtedly long remain one of the world's most revered and iconic religious treasures.